When we moved into this home over 12 years ago, one of the first things I did was start a garden. I had always wanted to have a garden, and we finally had enough room. I read Mel Bartholomew's Square Foot Gardening and learned enough to get started. I went to Home Depot and had them cut the wood for my first raised bed. I made 4x4 foot beds out of the least expensive untreated pine, brought the wood home. My son and I put those garden beds together and my gardening journey began. Fast forward 12 years, those initial garden beds have produced pounds and pounds of delicious food for my family, but they have definitely seen better days and are really falling apart. There are also a couple of things I would like to change about the layout and placement of the beds. It's definitely time for a garden makeover in this part of the garden. In today's video, I'm going to show you the before, the during, and after of this garden makeover, and hopefully you'll get a few ideas to implement in your own garden. But if we haven't met before, my name's Angela from Growing in the Garden, and I love to share garden inspiration and helpful tips so you can be successful in your own garden. So let's talk about the before. This part of the process is crucial. It's important to understand where you're at and evaluate what has worked and what hasn't. It's like living in a house. Before you remodel it, you understand it a little bit better and know which things you'd like to change. So some of the things that I considered before making a plan for this garden makeover was that this area of the garden doesn't get much sun and actually gets a fair amount of shade, which sometimes is a good thing during the hottest months of the year, but because of that lack of sunlight, this part of the garden is definitely not as productive as other areas of my garden. Another consideration is the walkway. My initial placement of the beds put them smack in the middle, which left me about 2 feet on either side, which isn't quite enough and gets kind of tight when I'm pulling carts of compost in and out. Because this isn't an ideal growing area, I'd also like to maximize the open space and possibly add a garden shed of some sort. My initial beds were only about 6 inches deep, and I've learned that things grow best in beds between 12 and 18 inches deep. So I definitely wanted to add deeper beds. Armed with that information, I was ready to make a plan and start obtaining supplies. Other areas of my garden, I use the deep root cedar beds from Gardeners. I especially like the metal corners that keep the beds held together really well. I also love the planting depth. Those beds are 15 inches deep. They also come in various sizes, which is super helpful when I'm planning out this space. I'd added garden grids from Garden in Minutes to this area over here previously, and I want to reuse those grids. So I know that I'd like my beds to be the same size so I can reuse those garden grids easily. My plan for the garden is to move the beds closer to the house to maximize the available sunlight. Moving them over a foot actually gives them a little bit more sunlight each day. It also has the added benefit of opening up that pathway on the other side of the bed. So the garden beds will be 2 feet away from the house and the pathway will be 3 feet wide. I lined up the first bed with my kitchen window. I love looking out my kitchen window during sunflower season and seeing the lovebirds. So I knew that I wanted to keep this as part of my plan. There's several plants that are actively growing, and I like to try and salvage those plants. One of the beds is also an asparagus bed that has been growing for a while. The asparagus would grow better in an area that received more sun, so I'm going to transplant that asparagus to another part of the garden and try and salvage some of those perennial herbs that are growing and add them back into the beds when they're done. So for this project, I'm going to need 3 4x4 foot raised beds and 1 4x6 foot raised bed. I'm going to use my existing garden grid, but I will need some new fittings for the irrigation tubing, and I'm going to definitely need some soil because these beds are much deeper than my previous beds. Once I gathered my supplies, it was time for the makeover to begin. Demo day was a lot less dramatic than I thought it would be. I literally just had to push a little bit on those beds and they completely fell apart. They really were on their last leg. Once we removed all that wood, took the garden grids off and stored them away for later, we were ready for the makeover to begin. The first step was to get all of those garden beds put together. It's important to put the beds together on a level surface so that the beds themselves are level. My son put those beds together for me on our basketball court, and those beds were nice and level, and once they're put together, it's easy to move them to the garden. I removed all the salvageable plants and put them in a holding area until they could be planted in the new garden beds. I dug up all those asparagus roots and put them in a new garden bed in another area of my garden that gets more sun. I'm happy to report that those asparagus roots transferred just fine and are growing really well. The next step was to push back all the bark and put that first bed in place. The placement of the first bed was really important because the measurements for the other beds were going to go off of that first bed. So I lined up that first bed with my kitchen window and then transferred the soil from that initial garden bed into that bed, being sure to grade and level that ground underneath and make sure that things were nice and level. We kept clearing the area as we dug into that soil from the existing beds to transfer it to the new beds. One of the beds had a surprising amount of my neighbor's lemon tree's roots. So we dug down and dug out all of those roots, and I now have zero guilt about using any of those lemons that hang over the fence a little bit. One by one, we put each of the beds in, grading and leveling as we went, and being sure to measure each time that the beds were the right distance from the house, the right distance from each other, and level. Once the beds were all in place, the next step was to add in the sprinkler lines. It's best to do this before you add in the soil so that you can put the tubing up through the beds and then it's not visible on the outside. Once those sprinkler lines were in place, we filled the beds back up with soil. For the last 12 years, I have mixed my own soil, adding in compost and vermiculite and either peat moss or coconut coir. I've done this by hand forever. This time, Arizona Worm Farm delivered the Growing in the Garden raised bed mix, which is a pre-mixed combination of those three things. It was so nice to fill up our beds with the pre-mixed soil. It made it so simple. Once those beds were all filled with soil, I added in the garden grids, but the pressure was off. I had done something wrong. Way too much pressure at the beginning, not enough at the end of the line. So we had to run a direct line to each bed. We added an additional valve to the sprinkler box, and now I can turn them on and program them from my phone. No more dead batteries in the timer from the hose. Once that watering was dialed in, I added a little bit of all-purpose fertilizer to give those initial plantings a little boost. Now for the fun part, adding plants to the beds. I put those plants from the holding area, a lot of those perennial herbs, back in the bed and added some other plants to the garden. And if you know me, you know I love vertical gardening, so of course I added some vertical elements to the garden as well. I'm really happy with how this garden makeover turned out. Here are a couple of things I learned along the way. Those citrus roots taught me a great lesson. I will definitely think twice before planting citrus or any other tree near my garden beds. I wish I had tested and redone the watering before I filled the beds, but I'm glad we were able to figure it out even after the beds were filled. That pre-mixed soil from Arizona Worm Farm was a game changer. It was wonderful to fill the beds with the pre-mixed soil. I'm also very happy with my choice to use the deep root beds from Gardeners. In addition to being really functional, I really love the look of these beds. I'm really happy with how this garden makeover turned out and looking forward to many seasons of harvesting fresh food from these garden beds. Thank you so much for watching.